When affordability becomes the sole battlefield, victory becomes meaningless. For generations, China's ascent seemed inevitable. The manufacturing powerhouse operated with such merciless precision, it resembled performance art. Metropolises that refused rest. Production facilities blazing until dawn. Costs tumbling with mechanical regularity until Western rivals simply abandoned the fight. This was the phenomenon of magnitude and orchestration. A nation converting human energy into economic dominance. Yet every phenomenon conceals a price. And China's most formidable asset, its capacity to manufacture everything more affordably and rapidly, has transformed into the exact force dragging it under in 1978. Deng Xiaoping shattered one of socialism's most sacred prohibitions. He declared that accumulating wealth was not disgraceful, it was nationalistic. And with that proclamation, he triggered one of history's most explosive economic metamorphoses. Instantaneously, farmers transformed into businesspeople. Rural landscapes converted into manufacturing hubs. International capital recognized an opportunity. Inexpensive workforce, boundless manpower, and a state hungry for partnerships. China launched designated economic territories. Experimental municipalities where conventional constraints dissolved. Just one objective: draw investment and generate exports. The results exceeded expectations. Shenzhen, a modest fishing settlement of 30,000 inhabitants, mushroomed into a sprawling megacity of millions. Within 20 years, the blueprint proliferated universally. Regional administrations borrowed and constructed motorways, energy facilities, commercial complexes, all to attract manufacturing. By the early 2000s, China was consuming global appetite for everything. Every Western corporation, seeking survival, relocated operations there. Yet beneath that relentless rise lurked a perilous motivation. Achievement meant undercutting everyone else. Each region battled for factories by slashing costs. Companies competed by trimming boundaries, diminishing standards, eliminating returns. Everyone pursued expansion. Nobody pursued longevity. It was a descent toward minimum standards masquerading as advancement. By 2015, China's steel capacity alone surpassed the remainder of the planet combined. Entire manufacturing districts were generating products faster than worldwide appetite could consume them. Costs began declining through desperation. Factories didn't decelerate when returns evaporated, they intensified, hoping quantity could compensate for deficit. It couldn't. That's when a fresh terminology began circulating: involution. Involution isn't merely about individuals laboring harder for less. It's about corporations generating more for less. Competition that ceases being about innovation and becomes about endurance. An entire sector locked in a zero-sum conflict where the sole remaining weapon is cost. Solar technology, electric automobiles, power storage, all emblems of China's modern economy, became its battlefield. Countless firms, many state-supported, saturated markets with indistinguishable products, each slashing costs to undercut competitors. Boundaries dissolved, but nobody dared halt. In a framework where output equals validation, surrendering production means surrendering dignity. This explains why China's solar technology is now distributed below expense. Why electric automobiles accumulate in storage awaiting purchasers. Why technology corporations battle for identical shrinking domestic appetite even as their valuations plummet. And why, despite record exports, industrial returns declined over 20% in 2024. Because when everyone competes to be most affordable, cost becomes the sole element that can descend. That's not capitalism accelerating. It's capitalism consuming itself. Beijing has witnessed this previously. In the 2000s, when overproduction in coal and steel pushed costs to the floor, they had to slash capacity, forcefully closing operations, terminating hundreds of thousands of employees. 2 decades later, it's recurring. Only this time, the casualty isn't a singular industry. It's the entire growth paradigm. By the 2020s, China's productivity apparatus had transformed into an economy trapped in an arms race against itself. The world observed record exports and gleaming facilities. But internally, profit boundaries were collapsing. The phenomenon had ceased creating wealth. It was merely recycling it faster and more thinly every year. This is what economists label overcapacity. But in China, overcapacity isn't a defect. Its strategy. China's government has perfected weaponized productivity using subsidies to maintain industries alive long enough to obliterate competition. In industries like solar technology and electric automobiles, Beijing doesn't mind losing capital short term. It wants control of tomorrow. Regional administrations pour billions so companies can distribute products below expense. Not to endure, but to eliminate rivals. The logic is brutal. Saturate the market, undercut everyone, and wait. Western competitors bound by shareholders can't sustain the pace. They collapse. And once the global supply network depends on Chinese production, China can elevate costs and dominate the value network. This playbook isn't novel. But this time, the magnitude is unprecedented. These aren't antiquated commodities. They're the materials of tomorrow: lithium power storage, photovoltaic technology, electric propulsion systems. The arteries of the 21st century economy. In theory, it's brilliant. In practice, it's precarious. There's a threshold to how long an empire can lose capital strategically before the framework begins to decay. When every sector anticipates the government to cover deficits, productivity becomes addiction. The boundary between national strategy and national burden blurs. It's not the collapse of appetite that destroys an empire. It's the collapse of meaning. Regional administrations need factories operating to service debt. State-controlled banks need those factories borrowing to justify balance sheets. If any part of the chain halts, the rest unravels. So everyone continues pretending that more output equals more prosperity even when it no longer does. This is the political logic behind state capitalism. Production is proof of control. When expansion falters, the state constructs another factory. When costs fall, it lowers them further. The solution to every imbalance is more of the identical imbalance. It's survival. Because China's economy isn't just an engine of wealth. It's an engine of legitimacy. The paradox is brutal. China's industrial overproduction keeps inflation low worldwide. Yet it also depresses its own compensation and appetite. The nation that elevated hundreds of millions out of poverty now struggles to raise living standards for those it already elevated. China didn't invent this trap. History did. Britain's coal industry once flooded global markets, driving costs so low that even British miners couldn't survive. Japan's miracle economy in the 1980s hit the identical wall. Rome's downfall began with overproduction. Vast estates pumped out so much grain that costs collapsed, bankrupting small farmers. Rome fed itself into imbalance. Every empire that masters productivity eventually faces the identical test. Can it cease optimizing long enough to survive? China's leaders discuss rebalancing, endlessly shifting from investment expansion to consumption. But rebalancing takes time. And time is the one resource a framework addicted to expansion doesn't possess. While Beijing attempts to steer toward innovation, its provinces still construct more factories. Because that's what their incentives demand. The paradox is that many of China's most overproduced products are the very things the planet needs for energy transition. But when costs collapse and companies fail, even green revolutions stall. Affordable abundance becomes a trap. Not because it fails to create wealth, but because it destroys the motivation to create more. China's problem isn't too little productivity, it's too much. It's an empire that has mastered production, but lost its equilibrium. A framework that can flood the planet with products, yet can't generate enough appetite to make it profitable. This is what happens when expansion becomes identity. When production replaces meaning. When the measure of advancement is how much more affordable you can make something that nobody needs more of. That's not development. It's involution on an industrial scale. And like every empire before it, China is learning that there's nothing more expensive than being too affordable. Because when a framework optimizes everything except equilibrium, eventually the only thing left to destroy is itself.